All right, hello everybody, and welcome back to another forecast slash weather discussion. Today we're going to be discussing the severe weather that's expected to come about across the southeast, mid plains, and lower plains. Today is expected to be a all hazards threat, so that means tornadoes, hail, and wind. All right, here's our Storm Prediction Center day one outlook. And as we can see, we have three isolated slight risk, and then we have a large marginal risk extending from the mid plains down to the southeast. With this, there are three isolated 2% tornado risk with a isolated 5% on the Kansas-Oklahoma border. And then we have two 15% wind risk, and then we have one large 5% wind risk expanding our entire risk area. And lastly, we have three 15% hail risk with one hatched up here near our Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma border. And then we have a 5% expanding from the top of our risk area to the Louisiana, Mississippi border. For our day two, we have a very large marginal risk expanding from the southeast all the way with a little tongue sticking up into New Mexico and Texas. This is expected to be mostly a wind and hail risk, with both of those being very small. Both of them are actually at 5%. Our wind risk is 5% and our hail risk is 5% across the entire area. We have a day three slight risk over the Carolinas, and I expect that they will upgrade this risk as we get closer to Friday. Here's our long range precipitation forecast from our GFS. As we can see, we have storms bubbling up in Texas associated with a remnant low and disturbances from the upper levels and yesterday's mesoconvective system. And then as we go on through the day, we can see our upper level low really starts to crank out here. And what that's going to do, that's going to fire off storms. As we move into Thursday, we see our line of storms from today's convection kind of move off. And then we see our expected sort of daily storms in western Texas caused by heating. And as we move into Friday, this is when we see a lot of weather caused by our trough, and that will come up as a line moving across Louisiana to Pennsylvania. And then that is where that day three slight risk is going to be in the Carolinas near our trough. After this, it appears that we get somewhat of a break as ridging builds across the central US, as we can see here. But this break is expected to end as we move into early June, as some tropical weather is expected to initiate some storms back here near the Four Corner States. And then we have a large trough digging in that's expected to bring severe weather to the mid and upper plains. After that, we continue our pattern with disturbances here and there causing severe weather. But after June, we see the GFS actually predicting some tropical weather down here near Florida. At this moment, this has a very, very low risk of happening. In fact, it most likely is not going to happen at all. So there is no need for concern about this. If this does happen, you will definitely hear about it from the National Hurricane Center. And yeah. Okay, here is our upper level analysis. Today, we can see that we have a little trough spinning across our southeast that could cause scattered storms. And then as we move on through the day, we see some disturbances build in across these areas that's caused by our upper level trough up here, and then our two lows over here. And what that's going to do, that's going to cause scattered convection across these areas. In the end, this is not a very large amount of forcing, so storm coverage is sort of uncertain, but it is likely that there will be storms in these areas. And as we move on through Thursday, we can kind of see our upper level trough sort of starts to dig in, and we get this long defined jet streak. What that's going to do, that's the cause for our wide marginal risk tomorrow. Storms could bubble up pretty much anywhere under this and potentially be severe, but chances are not super high. And then as we move into Friday, we see our jet really start to crank. And in front of this, that's the cause for our slight that we have situated right here, along with scattered storms along this back over near Texas and the Gulf Coast. Let's look at simulated reflectivity from later. What we do notice is that the HRRR is picking up on our remnant low from our mesoscale convective system. And what it's going to do is that as we go further into the day, that low is going to initiate storms south of the Dallas-Fort Worth complex, and those will have a decent risk of hail and tornadoes and wind, so a decent risk for all threats. That low will maximize shear in this area, and if these storms can stay somewhat discrete, they can produce. Another thing we notice is that our disturbances and heating are causing a lot of storms down here, which won't really affect the United States at all. But we are expected to see some convection in far western Texas as the day moves on up here. This could pose a very small threat, but that is all it's expected to pose, nothing large. And then up here in our main risk area, we can see the winds going in all different directions with counterclockwise rotation. That is indication of a surface low, and that is expected to initiate storms near mid-afternoon. If these storms can stay discrete, we actually have one supercell right here in our 5% area. That's something to look out for later. And if these storms can stay discrete, they will be in a pretty good tornado environment, actually. The low shear will be maximized in this area from the surface low, and there's expected to be decent recovery up here with decent cape and decent moisture. And then as we move forward, this is expected to grow into a big line of storms, posing mostly a wind and hail threat, but we cannot rule out tornadoes, little spin up tornadoes with lines like this. So that's something to be aware of up here near the Kansas-Oklahoma border. Here is our cape and shear model from the HRRR, and what we can see, there is actually expected to be pretty good recovery up here near our upper low, getting up to 3,000 cape. So that's going to fuel storms. And then over here in the southeast, we see some recovery with peaking areas of 3,000 cape over here as well. And then over here, we see some recovery with areas mostly around 2,500 to 2,000 cape. That is certainly enough cape to fuel storms, but it's not a super large amount like we have seen the past couple of days. Today, I do want to look at our significant tornado parameter, because that is expected to be higher than we have seen the past couple of days, with an area peaking around 3 in our main risk area up here on the Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma border. And then we see scattered 1s and 2s across the rest of our risk areas. So nothing of super concern out there. Let's look at our SRH, so our helicity. And what we do notice up here near our main risk area, there is definitely enough spin in the air for tornadoes. Back in our other risk areas, as we can see, there is not loads of spin, so that's going to hinder our tornado risk in our other risk areas. Here are our dew points for today. Now, what we will notice is that going into the afternoon, we actually see a lot of advection up here near our low, so kind of sucking in that warm and moist air, and we get up to 60 dew points. Now, one thing I do want to say is that normally 60 wouldn't be superb, but because of where we are, because the elevation is higher, the further north we go, lower dew points are equivalent to higher dew points far south. So 60 would be equivalent to a 65 or 70 down here in southern Texas. And for our other areas, we do see that there is a destabilizing air mass over here south of our boundary where storms are expected to be later. And then we can also see that in our Texas area, our western Texas area, we could see the clashing of air masses between the dew point gradient. And we do see that there's not loads of moisture over here, 50s and 49 dew points. That's it's pretty low for this area for storms, but we cannot rule out a storm or two down here. In our central Texas area, we see high 60s and possibly little pockets of low 70s. That is enough for storms, so moisture will not be as much of an issue for those. Let's take a look at our sounding. So out here, this is our sounding from our Western Texas risk area. Immediately what we notice, very straight photographs, so that's going to favor that wind and hail risk with very low level shear. As we go over to our helicity, this reflects our low level shear. But what we do notice is that we have enough shear in the upper levels, so decent bulk shear that will sustain any storms that do get going out here. Another thing we notice is that our dew point and temperature are somewhat far apart, so it is going to be harder for these storms to get surface based and pose that tornado threat. We do see good lapse rates though, good cape, and a lower precipitable water today. So what that does mean is that these storms will definitely be capable of producing hail and wind, more be it at a more elevated state. So the risk for tornadoes is very slim, but we cannot rule it out with rotating storms. Here is a sounding from our Central Texas risk area. We see more curving in the lower levels with a straightening out in the upper levels, and this is associated with that surface low. It is reflected in our higher helicity levels, higher low level shear levels, and we do have enough bulk shear to sustain these storms. We also do notice some veering as height increases, so that helps with spin in the atmosphere. We do see enough cape for storms. A higher precipitable water, these storms could definitely produce large hail. And then our dew point versus temperature is somewhat close, so these storms will be able to be surface based and pose all threats. Last but not least, we have our Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas border risk area, and immediately we see quite a bit of curving in the lower levels. And that is going to be from that surface low up there. We have really high helicity, good low level shear, and then enough bulk shear to sustain storms. Then over here we have solid cape, a good temperature dew point difference gradient for this region of the country, solid lapse rates, and then what we do see is a lower precipitable water, so these storms have the possibility of not being rain wrapped. Okay, let's take a peek at our excessive rainfall outlook. We have a slight in southeastern Texas on the Gulf, and that is associated with our mesoscale convective system from yesterday. And then we have a marginal spanning from Wyoming to Louisiana, and that is associated with the storms that we are expected to see out here. Here's our 6 to 10 day temperature outlook for June 2nd through the 6th, and it is expected to be toasty in the east, but cooler out west, with specific areas of increased confidence about how hot it's going to be. Florida, of course, and then the Great Lakes region, so Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan and Illinois. Last but not least, our precipitation outlook. It is expected to be above average precipitation in the Four Corner states and Florida, which will help with the droughts in those areas, and below average out here in New England, which is going to be associated with that trough.